This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. I'm feeling rather lonely in the feedback studio today. I have two empty chairs next to me. Sitting on one, I'd hoped to have the BBC's Director of News, here to talk about the savings that are being planned in her department. We put out the other chair for the boss of local radio, as his stations will have to save money by sharing many hours' worth of programmes, after a pilot project which the Director General of the BBC described as well received.
We've done some experiments on this already, and the feedback from listeners has been rather positive to this. So I think, although I appreciate there's been a lot of anxiety through the process about whether local radio was going to be victimised or in some ways be at the bottom of the pecking order, that's not where we've ended up.
You beg to differ. Now back from the future to the present. Would you rather hear this?
Unemployment has reached a 17-year high. In response, Britain's jobless youth have begun a 17-year high.
Or this. As usual, your verdict on new comedy on Radio 4 is bluntly expressed. And also in this edition of Feedback, I'll be finding out what's the best day of the week for me to die on, if I want to make it onto Radio 4's obituary programme Last Word, in a dull week. But first, English local radio. For 7.5 million people, local radio is their primary link with the BBC, and it's being cut back by just over 4% in what's spent on output or programmes, but there will be significant job losses on top of that. As a result, listeners to the BBC's 40 local radio stations in England will soon have to get used to sharing some programmes with neighbouring stations during off-peak times and have their specialist evening programmes replaced with one pan-England show. Mind you, some feedback listeners think those cuts should go further. One of our followers on Twitter says, by and large, local radio is terrible. Richard White of Broadstairs in Kent would also be happy to see the back of local radio, as would Andrew Slater.
My point is that the BBC provides a first-class national service which we all love. However, I don't believe that local radio is providing that same sort of quality, and it is a service much better provided by the commercial sector, who are more than capable of handling the local phone call-ins and local news items.
Andrew Slater, but many others feel quite differently, and concerned listeners are making their feelings known on Facebook, Twitter, in blogs, and of course to us here at Feedback. Andy Boddington lives in Ludlow and is a big fan of Radio Shropshire. He thinks that if the Director General, Mark Thompson, had wanted to destroy local radio, he couldn't have come up with a better plan than DQF.
It's where Shropshire comes to talk.
Why not join the debate?
Proud to be part of your county.
BBC Radio Shropshire.
I think that delivering quality first seems to treat radio, local radio, as a series of slots that can just be interchanged and switched between regions, national and local. It's not the case. It's a community. It flows from one to the other. Presenters hand over a baton. There's the story of the day, the concerns of the day. In Shropshire here, we're having a heavy period of cuts, like everywhere. It's really difficult to get any debate going on in council chambers about that. Decisions seem to be made largely behind closed doors. The one place that they're called into account is on our local radio station.
I've been hearing from Caroline Thompson, who's Chief Operating Officer at the BBC. I asked her why no services were being cut.
I was really concerned to hear Caroline Thompson speak on PM the other week.
Do you listen to much local radio?
I listen to a bit, yes. I listen a lot in Cumbria.
When she said that she listened to local radio a bit when she was in Cumbria. And I really have this question: how can the managers of the BBC make decisions about local radio when they only listen to it a bit? When I first read Delivering Quality First, I found that, the big stations, the chattering classes on Radio 4, are fairly well protected. Where the cuts really, really hurt are amongst the 40 local radio stations. That's 40 different voices, all with their local protests. And if I wanted to destroy local radio, then destroying quality first is a strategy that I'd take to do it.
Andy Boddington, and yes, he did say destroying quality first. A slip of the tongue, I'm sure.
Hello, my name is Alison Stancliffe. I live in Tynandweir. It is really important to have regional variations on news. I find the local radio news station really helpful, and we will lose a lot if we lose that local coverage.
BBC Radio Merseyside.
Hello, my name is Trevor Rhodes and I'm from the Wirral. I admire the way in which Radio Merseyside consistently produces distinctive high-quality programmes despite an already severely constrained budget. I am therefore appalled that local radio is being targeted for some of the harshest cuts while some other services are being shielded.
Well, the proposal for local radio stations to share some programmes was piloted in South East England and Yorkshire. Audiences in both areas were consulted by the BBC, and it was on that basis that the corporation says that local radio audiences would not object to sharing programmes. BBC Surrey and Sussex is Tamsin Vincent's local station. She was told that the proposals were based on very detailed and scientific audience research. But she says neither she nor several hundred visitors to her blog, Save Local Radio, were consulted, and they aren't happy to share.
We started on our forum a dedicated petition. We had many, many comments. One petition is now 2,500 names and comments. Therefore, when the DQF proposals were announced in early October by Mark Thompson, I heard him being interviewed on BBC 5 Live, where he cited the two networking trials, and he said there had been a positive listener reaction to these trials. And I would actually say that I am aware that in the north as well they had a petition running against that networking.
This is the BBC explanation of how they carried out their research.
We undertook both quantitative and qualitative research around the local radio content sharing pilots in Yorkshire and the south east of England. We asked whether the audiences felt that the content still felt relevant to them and whether they would be less likely to listen to the programme as a result of the content sharing. A significant proportion of listeners were unaware that they were listening to shared content.
Listener Tamsin Vincent did draw comfort from the fact that she'd be able to put her thoughts directly to the Director-General Mark Thompson when he appeared live on Victoria Derbyshire's show on 5 Live on Monday of last week.
A lot of listeners were expecting to put their points to him, including myself, but he pulled out, citing the fact that he had to consult with BBC staff.
No one's been able to tell us if Mark Thompson's phone-in has been rescheduled. Mind you, Tamsin is not the only one who feels left in the lurch.
As you will recall, and we mentioned this on the programme last night, the BBC did tell us we could have a live interview with the Director-General, Mark Thompson, today. But during the day, the corporation told us he would be in a meeting.
At this point, I turn to the chair next to me to see if David Holdsworth, the BBC's boss of local radio, has accepted the long-standing invitation to come onto Feedback, to answer your concerns and, for example, to explain in more detail how that audience research was carried out. But no, he's not here. I'll just check if he's in the corridor outside. David? No, he's not there either. In fact, no one from BBC management is available at the moment to talk about delivering quality first. They must be on a retreat, perhaps run by Trappist monks. Well, before silence descended, the Controller of English Regions did speak to Vanessa Feltz on her BBC London show, one of the 40 local radio stations. We thought you might like to hear some of what he said.
And we all seem to be saying the very same thing. We want more local radio, not less.
Well, the same Culture Secretary has agreed a licence fee for the BBC that doesn't allow any growth and gives us some new obligations. And there are really no parts of the BBC that aren't in one way or another suffering. The local news and travel will continue in whatever schedules we come up with.
But that's news. That's not discussion. That's not the same thing.
Let me address the point. That will have to vary in shared programmes to work for wider audiences if that's what we end up doing. I accept that, Vanessa.
Are you effectively killing local radio by making it non-local, so it becomes a kind of amorphous globular broadcast that people won't bother to listen to, so that in just a couple of years' time, or maybe 3 or 4 or 5, you can say, local radio, it's really not working, no one's listening?
Absolutely not. I believe in local radio. This set of proposals, subject to what the Trust have to say about them, is a prescription to try and ensure a long and healthy life for local radio. If you go back, actually, local radio stations often did share more than they do now, and they were successful then. There is a bit of pain, I'm not going to deny that, but I do believe that local radio will thrive, and we have set out to protect the very nature of local radio in terms of not only the news, the information, the travel, the debate, but also that close emotional relationship which we keep coming back to.
David Holdsworth, not on feedback yet. Well, of course, you can still have your say on all the Delivering Quality First proposals. You'll find details of the public consultation on the BBC Trust's website. Members of the Trust are also meeting listeners face-to-face in a series of round-table consultations. The first one took place in Londonderry in Northern Ireland this week. Listeners to BBC Radio in Northern Ireland are expecting to lose 8 hours of programmes a week, and Radio's Foyle and Ulster will switch to 5 Live at midnight. There will also be fewer programmes on weekend mornings, and on top of that, they will be hearing less from the BBC's Ulster Orchestra. This time next week, we'll find out what listeners in Derry who attended that event with the Trust have to say. Now, I've no intention of shuffling off this mortal coil just yet, but when I do, it would be nice to think someone would notice, and that perhaps in a quiet week I might make it onto Last Word, Radio 4's obituary programme. But how high is the bar that I or my corpse would have to jump? It's a question that pops up regularly in the feedback inbox, but not about me, of course. Christopher Stewart gets the ball rolling by wondering why influential computer programmer Dennis Ritchie did not appear in last week's edition.
This person has contributed as much to computing as, say, Steve Jobs, and if it wasn't for him, we probably wouldn't have an internet today, seeing as his computer operating system virtually powers the internet. I just couldn't understand why he just was not recognised.
My name is Richard Warnock, and I live in Melton in Suffolk. In a week where Ginger McCain, possibly the most famous horse race trainer as far as the Grand National is concerned, and certainly as trainer of Red Rum, why didn't Last Word mention him when they had a German conductor, an Afghan leader, an American hillbilly artist, an Italian mountaineer, and an American gay rights activist? I would have thought that Ginger McCain would be better known than any of those particular people.
My name is Robin Aitken, and I live in Oxford. I was irked by the selection in last week's programme when so much of the time was devoted to the obituary for George Baker. Now, I've got no animus whatsoever against George Baker, but his only claim to fame was that he played a fictional character in a non-too-distinguished television series, Inspector Wexford. And he was widely obitted, if that's the right word, elsewhere in the media, indeed on the BBC. Last Word is a programme which is a golden opportunity to give attention to people who often don't get a lot of media exposure.
Philip Sellers is the editor of Last Word, amongst other programmes in Radio 4's documentaries department. I asked him what's the latest the programme has been changed to include somebody who's just died.
It was at about 20 to 4, given that we transmit at 4 o'clock, to include Cyril Smith, who had died that afternoon.
The former Liberal MP for Rochdale.
Indeed so. And we changed the running order for that purposes.
So during the week, presumably, if you start with a list on the Monday at 11 o'clock, presumably people are dropping out of that list. I wouldn't say like dead flies, it would be an unfortunate expression, but they are dropping out, aren't they?
It's a constantly moving conveyor belt of people.
And do you have a sort of ideal programme in mind then? Light and shade, entertainer, politician? I mean, death doesn't always deliver you the perfect cast list, but do you have a shape of a programme you have in mind?
The fickle finger of fate does often deliver us a rather strange pack of cards. But no, I mean, my job as the editor on a programme like Last Word is to think about it as a radio programme. Unlike most obituaries that you might see in newspapers, actually what you're getting there are individual stories. Here, we have to think about what this sounds like over 28 minutes. So yes, sometimes we do think about getting a harder story, a political story, maybe a more controversial story, and then maybe a celebration of an actor's life or a performer.
So if you're a leading musician, it'd be helpful to die in the week when other leading musicians don't.
Well, we have in the past done a slightly themed item where we've linked people who often have been united in death across both their career and their demise.
Well, one listener, Robin Aitken, has questioned your choice of actor George Baker, giving him an obit. He died the week before the programme. Robin thinks he'd heard enough already about him elsewhere on the BBC. What did Last Word have to add?
Well, we thought long and hard about what to do about George Baker. I thought that he was a very familiar character to the Radio 4 audience that I have to deliver a programme to. And a lot of the coverage actually had been quite superficial. I mean, it had talked about his role in the Wexford Mysteries, but actually his career spanned a huge distance, and we interviewed Sian Phillips, who was there during the sort of middle period of his career when he was in I, Claudius. We also spoke, I think for the first time, to Ruth Rendell about what this man had done for her character. She had a character in her imagination, and it turned out, as you listened to the interview, that he wasn't it. He wasn't the character of her imagination. I thought it was rather interesting.
So it's what you can add. You don't deliberately, seek out people who have not been celebrated elsewhere and say, well, we'll make it up on Last Word.
No, we do. We do have a wide variety of people. I mean, in that same week, we celebrated the life of a Romanian dictator, who I think many of our audience would probably have struggled to have given you his exact dates or indeed his policy for the perestroika of that country. But we felt it took us to a very interesting place and somewhere that just really altered the mix of the programme.
Well, somebody else is concerned, Christopher Stewart, that you miss important people out. He says the day before last Friday's programme, the computer programmer Dennis Ritchie died. And Christopher reckons that his achievements were far more important than most of the people covered last week. Why didn't Dennis Ritchie make the programme?
One of the calls I have to make is not just the importance of the person's life, but actually how can we cover it? Can we get the best people to represent this life? I'm here to tell you that Dennis Ritchie is on this week's programme, because he is an extremely important part of how computers communicate with one another.
Well, why didn't he make last week? Was it just too close to the deadline? You didn't want to throw things out?
It simply wasn't that at all. We wanted to get the best person to describe his life. We wanted somebody who had known him from the very beginning, and that person was simply not available.
So do you have obituaries ready, as newspapers do, and all you do is pull them out, freshen them up, and put them out?
We have nothing on tape on a Monday, because we have no sense of how that death has been covered elsewhere. Where are we joining, on a Friday afternoon, where are we joining the story? Are we breaking it because it's Cyril Smith and it's 4:45, or are we almost the very, very last word on the subject?
Now, one of the first things that young journalists have to do when they work on a local newspaper, for example, is ring up relatives of the bereaved to find out what happened. Hideous job. Do you do that? Do you find yourself talking to people who've just heard that someone very close and dear to them has died?
We do, and that's a particular sensitivity that falls to the production team. The one saving grace in that situation is that the reputation of Last Word does precede us, and I think the majority of people who recognise that their loved one has made a significant achievement and that that's going to be recognised on Radio 4 by Last Word and treated in the way that we do treat people, I think does help us at that time.
Well, I'm interviewing you on Wednesday afternoon, so what's the running order at the moment? And then perhaps listeners can listen on the Friday and, see what happened.
I think I've given you a considerable insight into what's going to happen with Dennis Ritchie. I think you'll have to tune in at 4:00
to see if he makes it and who else does. Thanks very much. Philip Sellers. I see Colonel Gaddafi has made a late bid for inclusion this week. If you have suggestions of your own about who should be obituarised, if such word exists, then you can contact the Last Word programme via their web pages. And, of course, as always, I'd like to hear your thoughts, good and bad, about anything you've heard on BBC Radio. You can write to feedback, PO Box 67234, London SE1P 4AX, or you can leave a phone message on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or you can email me on feedback@bbc.co.uk. All those details are on our website. Now, you may remember that a couple of weeks back we had a discussion on feedback about how effectively or not BBC Radio represents disability issues. Subsequently, we received lots of letters, including this one from a listener specifically about schizophrenia, which he thinks is generally represented negatively on air.
My name is David Trippus, and I have schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is now rarely, if ever, mentioned on the BBC. I think that the media says that basically the schizophrenics are violent people who attack at random. It's this constant negative stereotype of schizophrenia that causes so much damage.
But just a few days later, David wrote to us again, after hearing something that made him change his mind.
There was a play called Henry's Demons, in which a young man described his schizophrenia and his trials and tribulations, and it was done so poetically and so sympathetically that I felt I had to write to the BBC again and say, almost, I'm sorry for being so heavy. When you do it, when you do stuff on disability, it's so good that it's good for one's mental health, because it made me feel less alone.
Henry's Demons was a recent afternoon play on Radio 4. It was adapted from a book by Patrick Coburn and his son Henry about Henry's schizophrenia.
I had started out that morning from my art college walking barefoot along the edge of the sea. I went east towards my home in Canterbury. I felt brambles, trees and wild animals all urging me on. It was as if they were looking at me. I could feel what they thought.
My name's Juliet Shepherd. I work as a psychiatric pharmacist, and it was really useful to hear the story, and perhaps it can help us to give people with mental illness a better service. I'd really like to thank the family for sharing their story with us. It's obviously not been a very easy thing to do, but I'm very grateful that they were brave enough to do it. Thank you.
The programme was produced by Karen Rose. She explained that it was the vividness of Henry's writing which made her want to adapt the book.
I hadn't really read anybody who's actually sort of in the middle of experiencing an episode. I hadn't seen anybody write about that experience in quite the way that Henry does. I mean, his imagery is really sort of vivid. He sort of creates this magical realism, and it seemed to me that it would make perfect radio.
Why do you think it's important that stories like this are heard?
There's still a stigma, I think, there around mental illness. So, you know, I think it seems to me from the response I've had, letters and stuff, that it's really useful just to share information, to share experience, really. I mean, it's a story about mental illness, but it's also, I think, a love story. I was so moved by the unconditional love that the parents showed for their son, and you know, I think as a family, I think they're quite extraordinary.
You obviously have a responsibility to the family. What about the responsibility to listeners who perhaps have mental health issues? Did you think of that when you were producing the programme?
My feeling about it was that as long as I told this story truthfully, then it would be okay. I can't hope to represent everybody with mental illness. You know, there are many, many, many stories out there, and at least it puts it out there.
I think I'm entering the final straight. There is a tree I sit under in the garden in Lewisham, which speaks to me and gives me hope.
Yeah. I see my light come shining from the west out to the east.
Now, Julian Barnes is a happy man this week and £50,000 richer. After being shortlisted 3 times, he's finally won the Man Booker Prize, something he had compared earlier to posh bingo. While most agreed Barnes was a worthy winner, some said the shortlist was distressingly popular. Mr. Barnes' prize-winning novel was The Sense of an Ending. 3 of the other shortlisted books, Half-Blood Blues, Snowdrops and Pidgin English, have all been books at bedtime on Radio 4 this year. All this debate will no doubt have been of great interest to the members of the inaugural Feedback Listening Club. Our first group of willing volunteers chose Open Book, presented by Mariella Frostrup, as the subject of their animated discussion.
Hello, in today's programme, Computers with Minds of Their Own. Should first-timers qualify for the Booker Prize?
Hello, my name's Angela Morley. I was a primary teacher for many years.
And I'm Janet Smith, and I'm a former civil servant.
I'm Jenny McWilliam. I used to be a lecturer in further education.
Together, we've been in the National Women's Register Leicester branch's book group for about 20 years. I'd like to hear more authors reading out their own work and discussing what their motivation was and how they wrote it and the struggles they had to write it.
I'm interested in the way that they cover commercial aspects of the literary scene and talk about the declining role of the private bookshop, for instance, or the independent bookshop. But I did get a bit lost when they went in depth into apps and the way phone apps may change the way literature is going to be written in the future. It really rather turned me off.
I'd like to see a bit more of an emphasis on authors' back catalogues, because there was an interesting programme on Thackeray that talked about him, and I only really knew Vanity Fair. But after that, I thought, well, I might see if I can read some more of his books.
I would appreciate a bit more perhaps on biography. An autobiography.
One of the things I liked best was simply hearing the author's real voices, which makes them somehow live for you better. I mean, it was amazing to hear Ruth Rendell's voice. I don't know, I wasn't expecting a person who wrote books like that to have that rather plummy but definitely elderly voice.
I pick it up, I see it on the shelf, I think I ought to read Many Dimensions again. And once I begin to read it, I can't put it down.
Can you give us a bit of a flavour of the story without giving too much away? I mean, at the moment it's sounding like a very highbrow Da Vinci Code.
The thing is, it is not in the least like the Da Vinci.
I'm a big Mariella fan. I think she's lovely. I think she's sunny and she's bright and she's articulate and she's amusing.
I was talking recently to an absolutely sweet old lady of 90 about the programme, and she said, I do wish she'd be a bit tougher on the writers. It's too cosy with them.
I think she could perhaps have a bit harder edge sometimes and ask some slightly more difficult questions. Recently she was discussing Joseph Heller and Catch-22, and all the verdicts on him were positive. But if you've read recently about the new book that's come out by his daughter, he was an absolute horror. She doesn't go into their nastier bits, perhaps.
By and large, I find Mariella very, very skilled and attractive presenter. Just occasionally others don't. I mean, for instance, when DJ Taylor was interviewing Barry Unsworth, somehow he just got up my nose.
One of your great strengths as an historical novelist, it always seems to me, is your command of idiom. You were talking previously about your files of research that you'd contrived. As you research a book of this kind, do you find yourself getting immersed in the literature of the period?
Yes, in the literature of the period, and Quality of Mercy.
At times when I'm listening to Radio 4, it gets up my nose because there seem to be such a lot of middle-class know-alls having their say down the microphone, and I must say it was a great relief when Barry Unsworth started talking.
Actually, that's what we sound like.
We don't, do we? We do.
Oh, yes, I think we do.
I couldn't possibly comment. Open Book is, of course, just one of a number of book-related programmes on Radio 4. There's also A Good Read, Off the Page, Book of the Week and Book Club, not to mention Front Row and all the other programmes on which the authors of new books often appear. Which programme is your favourite? Are too many books featured too frequently? And are some excellent popular novelists penalised for their popularity? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm off to read a book by one of my former researchers, The Fear Index by Robert Harris. I think he's quite promising. Goodbye. This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. I'm feeling rather lonely in the feedback studio today. I have two empty chairs next to me. Sitting on one, I'd hoped to have the BBC's Director of News, here to talk about the savings that are being planned in her department. We put out the other chair for the boss of local radio, as his stations will have to save money by sharing many hours' worth of programmes, after a pilot project which the Director-General of the BBC described as well received.
We've done some experiments on this already, and the feedback from listeners has been rather positive to this. So I think, although I appreciate there's been a lot of anxiety through the process about whether local radio was going to be victimised or in some ways be at the bottom of the pecking order, that's not what...
It's a community. It flows from one to the other. Presenters hand over a baton. There's the story of the day, the concerns of the day. In Shropshire here, we're having a heavy period of cuts, like everywhere. It's really difficult to get any debate going on in council chambers about that. Decisions seem to be made largely behind closed doors. The one place that they're called into account is on our local radio station.
I've been hearing from Caroline Thompson, who's Chief Operating Officer at the BBC. I asked her why no services were being cut.
I was really concerned to hear Caroline Thompson speak on PM the other week.
Do you listen to much local radio?
I listen to a bit, yes. I listen a lot in Cumbria.
When she said that she listened to local radio a bit when she was in Cumbria. And I really have the...
more than capable of handling the local phone call-ins and local news items.
Andrew Slater, but many others feel quite differently, and concerned listeners are making their feelings known on Facebook, Twitter, in blogs, and of course to us here at Feedback. Andy Boddington lives in Ludlow and is a big fan of Radio Shropshire. He thinks that if the Director-General, Mark Thompson, had wanted to destroy local radio, he couldn't have come up with a better plan than DQF.
It's where Shropshire comes to talk.
Why not join the debate?
Proud to be part of your county.
BBC Radio Shropshire.
I think that delivering quality first seems to treat radio, local radio, as a series of slots that can just be interchanged and switched between regions, national and local. It's not the case.
Job losses on top of that. As a result, listeners to the BBC's 40 local radio stations in England will soon have to get used to sharing some programmes with neighbouring stations during off-peak times and have their specialist evening programmes replaced with one pan-England show. Mind you, some feedback listeners think those cuts should go further. One of our followers on Twitter says, by and large, local radio is terrible. Richard White of Broadstairs in Kent would also be happy to see the back of local radio, as would Andrew Slater.
My point is that the BBC provides a first-class national service which we all love. However, I don't believe that local radio is providing that same sort of quality, and it is a service much better provided by the commercial sector who...
Where we've ended up.
You beg to differ. Now back from the future to the present. Would you rather hear this?
Unemployment has reached a 17-year high. In response, Britain's jobless youth have begun a 17-year high.
Or this. As usual, your verdict on new comedy on Radio 4 is bluntly expressed. And also in this edition of Feedback, I'll be finding out what's the best day of the week for me to die on, if I want to make it onto Radio 4's obituary programme Last Word, in a dull week. But first, English local radio. For 7.5 million people, local radio is their primary link with the BBC, and it's being cut back by just over 4% in what's spent on output or programmes. But there will be significant